we're going to begin our journey only because there's so much to do. Really, the sages of old used to sit all night of Passover and discuss the Exodus. We don't have all night. We also don't have all day. We have an hour. So we'll do our best. And many of the points we're going to mention, we mentioned in past years, because that's what Passover is all about. It's about re-experiencing. And so we're going to re-experience some of the meditations we did past years. Hopefully we'll add some new, so you don't go home and say, oh, I just got a review. You have to also learn something new every day. So hopefully we'll do a little bit of that. But on a serious note, as I always say, and you know this because you always see it in Judaism, Judaism is enamored or obsessed, call it any way you want, with the Exodus. So many mitzvot in the Torah are to commemorate the Exodus. We talk about the fact that every holiday, really, if you think about it, is, as we say in the prayer and we say in the Kiddush, Zecher liYetziat Mitzrayim, a commemoration of the Exodus. Every Shabbat is a commemoration of the Exodus. We say it in the Kiddush, again, commemoration of the Exodus. And that's because if we were not freed from Egypt, we would not be able to rest because we would be enslaved. And now the fact that we can rest is a testament to the Exodus. And of course, we know that there's a mitzvah to mention the Exodus every single day. And the Haggadah, in fact, brings a disagreement between two rabbis, and how one rabbi between one rabbi and the group of rabbis, and the rabbi prevailed with the help of his friend to establish the law that we not only mention the Exodus every day, but mention the Exodus every night, twice a day. And the way we do it when we say the Shema. The third paragraph of the Shema concludes, I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. And that is why we say that paragraph also at night. I don't mean to get too technical here, but the third paragraph of the Shema is the paragraph that discusses the obligation to wear the tzitzit, the strings on the fringes of the garment. The problem is that the commandment only applies during the day, not during the night. Why then do we say the third paragraph of the Shema at night as well? The answer is because we want to evoke the Exodus. And the conclusion of the third paragraph evokes the Exodus. I'm the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. So I always ask this, and it's an obvious question. If you want to commemorate the Exodus, it's nice to commemorate the Exodus once a year at the Passover Seder. It's a wonderful thing. Every culture does so. They celebrate their freedom. We do so 4th of July. Get your barbecues ready. We're soon going to get to celebrate the 4th of July. But if I told you there's a commandment every day, twice a day, to commemorate the 4th of July, and remember that we're no longer British subjects, and now we have the freedom to pay our taxes and to decide where our taxes want to go. So we have taxation and representation for most of us, unless you're living in DC, of course. But in any case, if I tell you commemorate that twice a year, you'll tell me, what are you talking about? Twice a day, you say, what are you talking about? Why are you obsessed with the past? And this leads to what the sages say in the Mishnah, way before the Kabbalah, and not before the Kabbalah was well known. The Mishnah says, every person, chayav adam, a person has to see himself as if he himself left Egypt. In other words, Judaism, we don't believe in anniversaries. We're not living in the past. We're not commemorating the past. Passover is the experience of leaving our own Egypt every year. And every year gives us the power to leave Egypt every day. And as you know, not telling you anything you didn't hear before, as you know, what is Egypt? In Hebrew, Egypt is Meitzar. Mitzrayim is the Hebrew word for Egypt. Mitzrayim means Meitzar, a narrow space. A narrow space is the limitation. No matter how great you are limited by what you have achieved up to this point. You're only so wise, you're only so kind, you're only so compassionate, whatever it may be. Whatever you do, I'm not the best I could be yet. And in fact, if I told you that, looking at you and evaluating what you achieved, I think you achieved everything you could achieve and you can't grow. If I told you that, you would be offended. You would say, what? That's it? That's all you think of me? You don't think I can become better? Right? So the bottom line is that everybody has the Mitzrayim, the limitation. And my limitation is what I have achieved till today. And if I don't grow, I'm in a state of stagnation, then I'm in a state of Egypt, limitation. Now I'm limited. I can have a big, nice, beautiful cell. I'm locked in my Egypt. I'm in a very comfortable place. So it's a big, beautiful cell. But if I can't go beyond myself, I am still in my Egypt. And therefore, every Passover Seder, we eat the matzah. And the matzah gives us the power to experience freedom, not to commemorate the past freedom, that too, but the past freedom, that same energy that was available when the Jewish people left Egypt over 3,300 years ago, that same energy is available on the night of Passover, invested in the matzah. When we internalize it, we have the power to escape our own limitations, not only for that night, but for every day of the year and twice a day, because we have to experience that it's Exodus both at night and at day, as we will discuss if we when we get to it, we have time. So that's the big idea of just to put us in the right frame of mind. We're not getting together, right? The rabbi wouldn't put the matzah on the plane for Erica just because to commemorate what happened 3,000 years ago. I mean, he would, because it's a mitzvah, but that the urgency wouldn't be there. The urgency of every person has to eat matzah, it's a commandment of Hashem, of course, but it also has the spiritual power that today we have to grow, today we have to leave our Egypt, today it's about the present and the future as well. So that's the first big idea, matzah's limitation. So if you're going to sit at your Seder, and one helpful meditation is I ask myself, and if I'm leading the Seder and they let me speak, in my house they don't let me speak, all the kids want to talk. So you have a few kids that go to school, and if you have a few the adults don't get to talk. Maybe at dessert, maybe after the kids are asleep, kids don't sleep the night of Passover, that's the problem. So maybe they'll let me say something. But if they let me say something, I would like to say, everybody should close their eyes for a moment and think, what is my Egypt? What's my biggest limitation? What do I want to grow that I was not able to achieve this past year? It doesn't have to be dramatic. It just has to be a little bit beyond what I have done till now. And as we discussed yesterday in the Haftorah, I just have to say, because it's so beautiful, but there's a Talmudic passage on the idea of the economy of the ancient times, where you didn't have a taxi, you didn't have Uber, you didn't have your car. So you would have to hire what they call a chamar, a person to lead you with a donkey. And they had set prices. And it was a zuz. It was one zuz for 10 miles. And then if you wanted to go an 11th mile, the charge was another zuz. So it's 10 zuz for 1 mile. Sorry, 1 zuz for 10 miles and 2 zuz for 11 miles. So the economists are going to say it doesn't make any sense. How could that be? But the reality is that the extra effort, going the extra mile, pun intended, going the extra mile is more valuable than the first 10. And the Talmud applies that to the idea that in those days, because they didn't have anything written down, people would review their studies 100 times. Whatever you learned, you had to review 100 times, because there was no books. There were no books. The oral Torah was not codified yet. So the Talmud says, well, if you review your studies 100 times, you're not really serving God. Why? That's your nature. You're not going beyond yourself. If you study 101 times, the 101st times, now we're talking, now you're going beyond yourself. Now you're serving God. Now you're breaking out of your Egypt. So what I'm trying to say is that the breaking out of my Egypt does not have to be dramatic. It's not, I studied 100 times, I'm going to break out, I'm going to study another 300 times. No, one more, just one little bit more. And that's already going beyond the self. So I have to ask myself, what is my Egypt? What is my Egypt that I want to go beyond, and I want to grow? Maybe it's being more patient. Maybe it's being more kind. Maybe it's being more thoughtful. But whatever it is, I need to grow. That's point number one about the concept of what is my Egypt. Now, it's also important to understand that if we had the time, we literally could go through the entire Haggadah and see that all the characters in the Haggadah and the Passover story exists within man himself. If I have an Egypt, I also have a Pharaoh. The Pharaoh is my oppressor that keeps me in my Egypt. Who's the Pharaoh? The Pharaoh is, of course, myself, the ego. And we discussed this in past years. I'll do this briefly. The ego is what keeps me limited. And there are many forms that the ego takes, many tricks the ego plays to keep me limited. Some of them are simply, I'm too proud. So for example, one example would be, let's say I have a relationship and the relationship has, there's some tension in the relationship. and I say, well, I want to help I want to apologize for what I did, but I want the other person to apologize first. So we have people for 50 years, they don't talk because they're talking about who's going to apologize first, right? So the fact that I don't want to be humble and take the first step keeps me limited. Another form of how the ego keeps me limited is I don't want to try because I don't want to be disappointed, and I don't want to feel the disappointment of failure. I think that if I fail, my ego won't survive it, right? So why would I try? Fear of failure, fear of rejection is the reason that people would stay in stagnation and not try to grow. Why would I come home and try to be more patient if I've been doing it for the past 10 years and I can't keep my patience? So I'm just going to give up trying and just say, this is my nature. Because I think that if I try and if I fail, fear of failure, then I think that my ego is not going to be able to withstand it. And if my ego doesn't survive, I won't survive. And the reality is that counterintuitively, the less I think about myself, the less I can break out of my Egypt. If I'm not focused on self, I'm not focused on my chances of failure, then I'm going to be able to grow. And the beautiful metaphor for this is there was a great chassid. His name was Rabbi Mendel Futterfass. And he's actually Mariashi Deren's great uncle. And he helped a lot of Hasidim escape Russia after the Second World War in 1946 and 1947. And eventually he was caught by the Soviets, and he was placed in prison for 20 years. And then eventually in 1965, he got out of Russia and he became a teacher in the yeshiva in Kfar Chabad, Israel. And the guy was sitting in Siberia in the Gulag for 20 years. So he had some stories from the Gulag. So basically, at night, all the prisoners, they had nothing to do, so they would do long Russian nights. So they would do talent shows. Everyone gets up and does their talent shows. Everyone shows a trick that they can do. So one time, there's a guy who says, I can tightrope walk. I can tightrope walk. And people say, impossible, you can't do it. And he says, no, I can do it. So they spread out the rope, and he walks on the rope. And everybody is amazed. They've never seen anything like this on TV. There was no TV back then. And everybody's amazed. How is this guy walking on the tightrope? So this chassid, Rabbi Mendel Futterfass, he understood what the Baal Shem Tov taught, that whatever you learn, whatever you see, there has to be a lesson in the service of Hashem. So since he was in prison for 20 years, when he came out of prison and became the teacher in the yeshiva in Kfar Chabad, he would keep telling all the students all the stories that happened and give a lesson in the service of Hashem. So he says you have to learn a lesson from the tightrope walker. How do you learn a lesson? So Rabbi Mendel, he walked over to the tightrope walker and says, how do you do this? What's the secret of the trade? How do you do this? How do you go forward and not fall and not be afraid to fall? So the guy says like this. He says, look, if I look down, I look on the side, I'm going to fall. Because I start thinking about myself and how tall I am and how high I am. And if I think about how high I am, I'm going to fall. But if I look straight ahead and I keep my eye on the goal, on the post where I need to go, I'm not focusing on self. I'm focusing on what needs to be done. Then I have no problem that I'm not going to fall. And of course, the lesson is the lesson of the matzah. It's ironic. The more I focus on self, the more likely I'm going to be afraid to move forward. I'm going to be afraid of failure. I'm going to be afraid to get injured. I'm not going to be able to move forward. And ironically, the greatest liberation is the humility. We think of humility in English. Humility has a bad rap. It's putting the self down, but that's not the way it is in reality, and certainly not in Hebrew. Humility is liberating. The liberation that I don't have to focus on my own worries, on my own attention, but I could think of the goal, move forward, and like that Russian walking the tightrope, we do the same every day, and we could stay focused on the liberation. And that's why the matzah, which is the symbol of humility, it's not inflated. It doesn't scream, look how beautiful I am. It's flat. It represents the humility. If it represents the humility, that is the key to our liberation. So these are the first 2 points we said. First 3 points, really. We said that matzah, if Egypt is the limitation, the oppressor is my own ego. No. And the antidote to the ego is the matzah, which is the liberation, which is the humility, which allows for us to focus on what needs to be done, on the goal, without focusing on self, without focusing on my own hurts and my own fears. And that's the key to liberation. And that's what we internalized on the night of Passover. So these are the first three big ideas. A lot more to say, but if anybody has any comments or questions or points up to this point, please share. Otherwise, we continue on our journey down the Seder. Okay, let's think about the matzah for a minute, because we want to get, if we really want to take apart the notion of how matzah creates the freedom. So the first point we said, matzah is humility. The less I focus on self, the more I could achieve. The less I focus on, am I going to fail? Am I not going to fail? Am I going to, how I'm afraid, what are people going to say? Are people going to laugh? Are people not going to laugh? All these ideas where I'm too focused on self and the inflated self, that's really keeping me trapped. And the ability to focus on the goal, not focused on the self, what I need to be done, what needs to be done, the other person or the concept or the agenda, whatever it may be, allows me to take the focus off self, and ultimately that's the secret to grow. So that was the first point we said, but there are other points. And if you want to think about the ingredients of matzah, so if you ever went to the matzah bakery, we used to take trips to the matzah bakery in Brooklyn. We haven't done it last year, obviously, because of COVID. Sometimes they actually brought the matzah bakery to Greenwich. But in any case, if you think about the ingredients, what are the ingredients of matzah? Very simple: flour and water. There's no taste. Actually, the matzah that you eat at the Passover Seder is not allowed to have taste. It's not allowed to have egg matzah, for example. Can't have egg in it because it's supposed to be bread of poverty, which maybe we'll get to. So you can eat kosher for Passover egg matzah or salted matzah or garlic matzah. You could do that kosher for Passover, but it's not kosher for this. It's not. You're not going to fulfill your obligation for the first night of Passover. First night of Passover, you have to eat what they call bread of poverty, just flour, just water. Okay, now, so those are the two ingredients. But I like to say there's another ingredient in the matzah. What's the other ingredient? The other ingredient is, of course, speed. Because matzah, just putting flour on water is not going to get you matzah, because if you wait 18 minutes, the bread is going to start rising, even though you didn't put in any yeast. But if you wait too long, it's going to rise. And the idea of matzah is bread, flour, water, and speed. And if you look at, in Hebrew, the word for procrastination, pushing something off, literally what the sages use the word, you're making something chametz, you're making something leavened bread. There's a verse that says, ushmartem et hamatzot, you should guard the matzot. Now, I think we discussed this a few days ago, the word matzot and the word mitzvot. Neil, did we mention that? Matzot and mitzvot.
We discussed that.
We discussed that they could be spelled the same. Matzot, mitzvot. So the sages say, when the verse says guard the matzah, to make sure the matzah doesn't become chametz, to make sure the matzah, the unleavened bread, doesn't become leavened bread, the sages say, guard the commandments. Because matzot is spelled with a vav, is mitzvot. We discussed it Friday, with the vav, without the vav. So you can read the verse, Shmartem et hamatzot, guard the mitzvot, guard the commandments. What does it mean to guard the commandments? So to guard the commandments, say the sages, guard the commandments, make sure they don't become chametz. Why? In other words, how so? Mitzvah haba liyadcha. If you have a mitzvah that comes to your hand, if you have an opportunity to do a mitzvah, al tachmitzena, don't procrastinate, but literally don't make it chametz, don't make it rise. So speed is matzah, and delay, procrastination, is chametz. That's the way the sages see it. In the Hebrew, it literally works. It's the same word. So what is the message here? So I need the humility, make sure there's no inflated ego, make sure there's no yeast that makes things rise, okay? But I also need speed. What does that mean? So one interpretation is as follows. I think this is a beautiful interpretation. Almost never do I tell myself, I want to do something destructive. I always tell myself, of course, I want to do something positive. I want to be nice to other people. I want to live a healthy lifestyle. I want to invest in the proper things. I want to put my time and energy in the right place. I want to speak to my grandmother, everything I want to do. But the way that what keeps me in prison is the procrastination. I'm going to start doing it next week. That's my prison. Of course, I'm going to be the kindest person who ever. Of course, I'm going to be the best father who ever lived. After the holidays, right? Right now we're in a rush. Right now we have to. Right now I can't keep my patience. But yeah, in a few days, oh, I'm going to be the best guy ever, right? So that's the problem. That's what keeps me in my prison. Is not that I'm a bad person, not that I don't want to grow, not that I don't know what steps are necessary to grow. All that is true. But I say, you know what? I'm going to start next week. I'm going to start my diets right after the holidays. That's what I tell myself every day. But in any case, so you see here that the problem, what keeps me trapped is the chametz, the idea of delay. And the liberation, part of the idea, what the matzah says, don't overthink. You have an opportunity to go beyond the self. You have an opportunity to do good for others. You have an opportunity to break free. Embrace it right now. If you're going to delay it, it's going to be chametz. It's not going to be matzah. You're going to be stuck in your prison because you don't have the key to get out. And the key to get out is the matzah, is the humility, but also the speed. And that is one notion of speed that is built in. And with your permission, I'll say one more notion of the speed, and then we will move on, of course, because there's so much to say. So I have to write down what we're saying, so I could summarize at the end. We talked about Mitzrayim, the Egypt. We talked about the Pharaoh. We talked about the matzah. Then we talked about the speed, which is don't delay. And then we're going to talk about one more idea of the speed. And at the end, last 5 minutes, we'll give a summary. So, because we're doing nuggets today. Okay, so what's the other notion of speed? This is from a great Sephardic sage, the Ben Ish Chai. He was a chief rabbi in Baghdad. Bob is not here, but I'll have to tell him this idea because he was a very prolific writer. He wrote like 100 books, very Kabbalistic, a great guy. So he writes like this. He says, what's the notion of speed? So he says there's two types of humility. We're saying humility. We like humility. Passover is humility. Matzah is humility. The problem with humility is that there is a dangerous form of humility. And the dangerous form of humility not only is not going to get you out of Egypt, but the dangerous form of humility will actually keep you trapped. And therefore, you have to make sure that you have the proper form of humility. What is a negative form of humility? So that's what the common notion of humility. The common notion of humility is I am nothing. I don't have the strength. I don't have the power. I'm no good. I'm humble. I have no qualities. And that is not humility. That is simply not being honest, right? If you're good at something and you say, oh, I'm so humble, I can't do it. That's not humility. That's just being dishonest. It's very frustrating to live with such people. I know somebody that related to me. The person is an unbelievable artist. And you say, could you please draw? No, I'm not so good. It's just annoying. You know, they see the person is delusional. The person is good at it. If you're good at it, embrace it and do it, or don't do it, but don't downplay your skills. It's just God gave you a gift. You have to embrace it. So there's somebody who keeps telling themselves, I'm no good, is not humble. I mean, that's the common notion of humility, but that's the negative notion of humility. And that's not going to allow you to break free. Because what that does for you is actually keeps you trapped. Because if you don't believe that you're able to, achieve, then you won't be able to achieve. It's going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's why the ingredients of matzah. Oh, so what happens when somebody thinks they can't achieve anything? That person stays in bed. That person doesn't have speed. That's the person where the humility drains the person of energy. But matzah is the opposite. Matzah is the humility which says, like a tightrope walker, I'm not focusing on self, I'm focusing on what has to be done. I'm not focusing on what the naysayers say. I'm not focusing on what my ego says, which my ego is trying to protect me from the fear of failure and the fear of rejection. Like I say, I wake up in the morning, my ego has a full-time job. Its full-time job is to protect itself, make sure nobody scratches it, make sure nobody bothers it. And to do so, it will keep me locked in my room, in my comfort zone, in my comfortable space, so I don't have to take any risk. But of course, if I'm not taking any risk, I'm not growing. So the idea that the matzah is not just humility, but the matzah is humility, bread, water, no yeast, humility, but it has speed built in. And if there's no speed, then it's not going to be matzah. The speed represents the healthy form of humility, not the humility that says, I have no qualities and robs me of energy, but it's the humility that says, there's so much to do. Don't focus on self, focus on what has to be done. And that humility actually infuses one with energy and speed and alacrity. And that's the humility that we are advocating to get us out of our own personal Mitzrayim, our own personal Egypt. So that is the second notion of speed that is within the matzah. Okay, I'm warning you right now, if there's no questions, I'm going to keep talking. This is, you are hereby warned. Okay, the next thing we want to talk about, the next big idea, is actually not a biblical commandment. It's a rabbinic commandment. And that is that on the night of Passover, we drink 4 cups of wine. If you don't like wine, you could drink grape juice, but the fruit of the vine. So we drink 4 cups of wine. Where did the sages pull that up from? Well, first of all, the sages introduced wine to so many rituals. If you think about it, for example, Shabbat, we make Kiddush on wine. But not everybody knows that, biblically speaking, the obligation to make Kiddush, to sanctify the day, is not on wine. It's just by a declaration. And the declaration, we actually say it in the prayer, or we could say it at home, but you don't have to do it on wine. The sages instituted that the Kiddush, the sanctification of the Shabbat and the holidays, should be associated with wine and done over a cup of wine. Same thing was with the marriage ceremony. The idea of the chuppah is a biblical commandment, but to institute, to drink the cup of wine at the marriage ceremony, that's rabbinic. Same thing Passover. Well, the idea to have a Seder is biblical. To eat the matzah is biblical. To eat the sandwich with the bitter herbs and the matzah and the Paschal offering which is the roast, that's biblical. 4 cups of wine are rabbinic. So let's think about that for a minute. What do the 4 cups of wine represent? And what does it represent, more importantly, in our spiritual service of liberation, of growing in the path to personal liberation and personal growth? So the first thing we have to begin with is a technicality. What? I don't know if it's a technicality. We want to start with the basics, I should say. Why did the sages institute to drink 4 cups of wine? What is the idea of the 4 cups of wine? So if you open up the book of Exodus, when Moses, in the second portion of the book of Exodus, when Hashem tells Moshe that I'm going to take the Jewish people out of Egypt to commemorate, because to fulfill the promise to their ancestors, God uses 4 expressions of redemption. He says, V'hotzeti, I will take them out. V'hitzalti, I will save. V'ga'alti, I will redeem. V'lakachti, and I will take them for me as a people. And the sages say, well, there's 4 expressions of redemption, so we have 4 cups of wine. Could you imagine if there would be 5 expressions of redemption? Well, there is a 5th. The 5th says, V'heveti etchem al haaretz, and I will bring you to the land. So that's really the reason of why we have, that's one of the reasons why we have a cup of Elijah, the 5th cup. Now, the 5th cup is not directly related to the Exodus, so we don't drink it, but we have it for the cup of Elijah to represent the future redemption, the future entering into the land of Israel. In any case, we have 4 expressions of wine, and we have 4 expressions of redemption, and we have 4 cups of wine commemorating the 4 expressions of redemption. Okay, what does wine represent in our spiritual service, in our spiritual growth, and how does wine differ from matzah? So we can get into the 3 and 4 number, but that's going to be too technical right now. The simple difference is, of course, matzah, we mentioned, has no taste. Matzah is, the sages call, the bread of poverty. Like I said, you cannot fulfill your obligation, even if your egg matzah is kosher for Passover. And today, I'm sure you can get matzah with, you can get chocolate-covered matzah, kosher for Passover. So you can have chocolate-covered matzah. There was a woman in Greenwich who started a company a few years ago called Mazel Tov. And this is really deep. There was matzah, taffy, and chocolate. It was delicious. It was wonderful. Wonderful for all year round. But you can't use it for the night of the Seder. Night of the Seder, the matzah has to be plain, no taste, no taste, no pleasure. It's just about humility. Humility is, I'm not doing it because I want to do it. That's my ego. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. That's the humility. But but what we see here, what the sages are saying, humility is step one. Acceptance is step one. But then you have to grow to the point where you actually enjoy what you're doing. And the pleasure is the wine, right? In the ancient world, the symbol of all pleasure, when the sages say you should eat matzah, you should make the kiddush on wine, or have your seder with wine, or the marriage needs wine. Wine represents taste, wine represents pleasure, which means you have to identify with what you're doing. So in other words, the beginning of the journey, the humility is, you want to change, you want to grow, change your habits, escape yourself. Don't do what's comfortable. Do what needs to be done, even if it's painful. If you think you put yourself in the shoes of the Jewish people who had to leave Egypt, that's really what happens. You have to escape. Escape means I'm leaving my old habits. I'm starting something new. It's not always easy. It could be difficult. It's a new path. That's the matzah. The matzah is, I'm not doing it because it tastes good. I'm doing it because it needs to be done. However, the sages say that's only the beginning. Eventually, once you incorporate the new habit, it's no longer matzah. It's no longer tasteless. Now it becomes pleasurable, right? Like any new habit. When Vicky tries to teach me piano, yeah, in the beginning it's hard, but after a while it becomes enjoyable, right? So if you think about it, in the beginning it's matzah. It's difficult, but it's liberating. Think about it. If I don't go through the difficulty, I'm going to be stuck in my old model. I can't grow. But if I have to practice, that's matzah. It's difficulty. It's no fun. It takes commitment. And it takes forcing oneself to escape. Escape means pushing yourself away from your comfort zone. Okay. But then, I don't think I'm there yet, Vicky, right? I don't think I'm there yet with the wine. But then if you keep doing it, you get to the state of the wine, you get to the state of pleasure. What was yesterday difficult, what yesterday represented escaping of self, meaning I have to put myself aside, put my own desire aside, and do what I need to do for growth. That will, say the sages, if you keep at it, that will become as pleasurable and as tasteful as the wine. So the purpose is not to negate the self or to escape the self. That's just the step one. That's just the breaking free. After you break free, and the moment of breaking free is difficult because it's starting a new habit, for example, a change, a practice. Now, but that will become as pleasurable and as tasteful as the 4 cups of wine. So that's what the sages add to the discussion, that in addition, on top of the idea of the humility, which humility is not focusing on self, but ironically, the more you don't focus on self, the more pleasurable that becomes with the 4 cups of wine. So now we touched upon the 4 cups of wine as well. So now we could continue to our last big point, and then we could start getting into the details. The last
Rabbi,
big point.
let me ask a question, Rabbi. I've always had a problem with this thought, especially as I'm a parent of teenage children and children in their 20s.
I have no answers for you. No, I'm kidding.
To me, as a parent, 4 cups of wine represents drunkenness and and represents irresponsible drinking.
So that wasn't the case at that time. In other words, because they were in that culture, they drank wine every meal, and the way we drink orange juice. So for those of us who drink juice, they drink wine. Remember what they had? They had water and wine. You see what I'm saying? They didn't have seltzer. They didn't have coffee, which I'm drinking right now. They had water or wine, maybe oil. No, we didn't drink the oil. They had water and wine. That was really on the menu. Okay, so they drank wine much more, and in that state, they didn't lead to drunkenness, especially not during the meal. Also, it's not so simple to figure out what was the alcoholic content. So the Talmud talks about ideas. Are you allowed to make a blessing on wine if the wine is too strong? And the answer is no, it's too strong. You have to dilute it with water. And it's not so clear how strong was the wine to begin with. And people that think about this, the winemakers today assume, at least what I have read, they assume that the wine that they made couldn't have been more than 12 or 13%. And when you dilute that with water, you're cutting the alcohol content in half. Okay, so it's not so terrible. Bottom line is, yes, it's not supposed to be drunkenness. If it's drunkenness, that's Purim. That's not Passover. Passover, it was joy, and wine is a symbol of joy. And therefore, if the wine is drunkenness, at least for your teenagers and maybe for myself too, you put in the grape juice. I'll be honest with you. I don't drink wine, at least not the first 2 cups. Because if I drink, even though the code of law says drink it, even if you get a headache, I drink 2 cups of wine, I'm done. I can't even think straight. So what I do typically is I drink the first 2, I drink grape juice. And then the last 2, I'm already sort of heading to bed. I'll drink wine the last 2. And if I get a headache, so be it. I'm going to sleep. It's not a problem. So you have to obviously, yes. So it's not, drunkenness is not the theme of the night.
Rabbi, have you heard the idea of adding a little bit of water, because the grape juice of the wine is very gevura and the water is chesed?
I have not heard that, but I'm not, like I said, the fact that I have not, lo ra'inu einu raya, the fact that I have not seen it is not a proof. At least in the Talmud, it's simply taste. It was like when you're supposed to make a blessing to God, you make it on the preferred food. So wine that wasn't diluted wasn't considered honorable. Like it's not, you're not going to honor Shabbat if you drink undiluted wine. Who wants to drink a cup of 14% wine? You sip it. You're not going to drink a cup. You're supposed to not a cup. You're supposed to drink a cheekful. Who's going to drink a cheekful of wine? Okay, but now we're going to be on the scope of my expertise. I don't know enough about wine. Certainly not about wine in the ancient world. I just know if it harms you, do what I do, drink grape juice. But to Neil's point, yes, it's not, the theme is clearly in the Talmudic times, people drank multiple cups during meals, it wasn't a question of becoming drunk. And no, you should not be drunk the night of the Passover Seder. It's about freedom. It's not about being enslaved to substances that could confuse us. Okay, fine.
About using a very small cup, tiny, teeny cup.
So you have a limit. That's a good point. That's a very good point. But the problem is that everything in the halakha and the Jewish law is regulated. The smallest cup you can use is the revit. It's 3.5 ounces. So
3.5
ounces. 3.5 ounces is your smallest cup. You probably don't even have to drink the entirety of the cup. You have to drink a majority of 3.5 ounces, right? Revis. Majority of 3.5 ounces. Some people have a custom specifically on Passover. They want to drink the entire cup. And therefore, Yelena, great idea. I do it myself. Get yourself a small cup. Not too small. Can't be a whiskey shot, which is 1 ounce, but not too small, but small. Yes, that's good. That's why we have time. That's why we're supposed to get together and talk, so we can give each other the practical advice. Enough with the philosophical ideas. You want the practical advice. How do I get by the Seder without having a headache? Okay, now we understand. Okay, 2 more big points, and then hopefully we can get into some details. Of course, the other 2 points is we have 2 more ingredients. I'll tell you right now what they're going to be. We want to talk about the bitter herbs, and then of course the sandwich with the matzah and the bitter herbs. Once we discuss that, I think we covered all the major ideas. So what are bitter herbs, and how does bitter herbs connect to the theme of freedom? How can I connect? What are bitter herbs, and how does bitter herbs connect me to freedom? Seemingly, the bitter herbs are actually a distraction, because we understand you have to appreciate the suffering you have to remember the suffering to appreciate the freedom. However, the sages say that everything you do on this night, you have to do in a way of expressing freedom. And that's why we recline. In the ancient days, they would recline the entire Seder, recline when they're eating, when they would literally recline on a couch and have the Seder, because that's the way people ate, at least the prominent people ate. Today, we don't do that, but we recline when we drink, we lean when we drink the 4 cups of wine and the matzah and the sandwich. So we have to, everything we do on this night, you have to do in a way of freedom, to symbolize freedom. And that's why the custom was any silver you have on your table, you have in your house, you would display. So even people who were poor, most of Jewish history, most of the Jews were poor. But the Passover night, you came out and you put out all your wealth, all your silver on the table to display freedom. Chani, my wife, went to do Pesach with her grandfather a year or 2 before he passed away in Israel. And it was a very small Seder. It was just her grandfather, her grandmother, and her. So 3 people, okay? But her grandfather insisted. They had a long dining room table. He insisted that she go and she bring down all the silver that they had collected from all the years and literally fill up an entire table full of the silver, whatever they had, and candles, whatever they had, and for 3 people, because that's what you do on Passover. The night of Passover is a symbol of freedom, and everything we do is to put ourselves in the state of freedom. Okay, if so, why the bitter herbs? The bitter herbs are counterintuitive. And what wasn't the bitterness of slavery? Why does the bitterness of slavery help us get out of our current, help us achieve freedom? So again, there's, just like I said, there's two forms of humility. There's two forms of bitterness. And the Tanya, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the founder of Chabad, in the founding book of Chabad philosophy, in the Tanya, there are 9 chapters that discuss at great length what to do with the feelings of sadness and melancholy. Because on one hand, the Hasidic philosophy and Judaism in general is allergic to sadness, because sadness pulls us away from Hashem. Where God is, there's joy. The problem is that sadness is a very human and very real and emotion that you cannot suppress. So how to deal with the sadness is a very big issue. Also, sadness is very debilitating. If I'm sad, I have no energy. If I have no energy, I cannot do what I need to do. Right? Rabbi Shneur Zalman brings the metaphor of, you have 2 wrestlers. Who's gonna win the wrestling match? Or 2 basketball players. Who's gonna win the match? Not necessarily the person who's stronger. Not necessarily the person who's more skilled. Who's gonna win? The person who's more enthusiastic. The guy who doesn't want to be here is not gonna win. Right? So you have to, so in other words, we have an obligation to seek to be joyous, because if we're not joyous, if we're sad, we are drained of energy, and then the evil inclination, the negativity within ourselves is going to win the inner battle. So if you want to stand a chance in the wrestling match with my own inner negativity, I must be infused with enthusiasm. And how to do that is not a simple matter. There's 9 chapters in the Tanya. Even with studying the 9 chapters in the Tanya, it's not so simple. It's a complicated matter. So, but over there in those 9 chapters, he differentiates between sadness and bitterness. And I'm not sure this distinction is conveyed in the English words, but in Hebrew, he coins these 2 phrases, sadness and bitterness. So, but the words are not so important. What's important is the emotion that stands behind these words. Sadness, again, is I am sad and I'm drained of energy and I'm lying in bed. Bitterness is I am sad and therefore I am motivated to make a revolution. There's a total different feeling. Motivate comes from the same place. I'm not happy with my circumstances. So there's 2 ways how the heart responds to not being happy with one's circumstances. One is, I'm sad, I give up. I just can't get out of bed. I'm not happy with my life. Another response to the same circumstance is, I don't like society. I don't like what I see in society. I don't like what I see in my environment. So I'm going to make a revolution. I'm going to change. I'm going to be motivated to change. So in some sense, the greatest motivator for escaping Egypt, remember, Egypt is stagnation. Egypt is being comfortable with where I am. I must have the ingredient that says I'm unhappy. Because if I'm not unhappy, then there's not going to be any growth, right? The whole idea of progress and the whole idea of ambition. Ambition is a blessing. You can't have ambition. You can't have growth without ambition. And what is ambition? If you think about it, ambition is, I'm not satisfied with what I have. I'm unhappy with what I have. And people who are very ambitious, some of them have a lot of trouble being very happy, because happy is the opposite. Happiness is content. And how content and ambition interact is tricky. It comes from 2 different parts of the soul. And of course, we have to cultivate both, but that's for another class. The bottom line here is, if the matzah is the content, the bitterness is the ambition. And ambition is, I'm not happy. But I'm not sadness, but bitterness. And that's what the bitter herbs represent. And that's why the bitter herbs too is critical for the process of breaking free and escaping from my limitation, because there has to be a sense of urgency, a sense of not making peace with my circumstance or with my scenario, with the scenario I'm in, if I want to grow, right? If I'm totally happy with where I am, what would motivate me to grow? So once in a while, I need a little bit of bitterness, never sadness. If you have sadness, you have to go speak to either your therapist or your Hasidic rabbi or your Kabbalist, or both, or all 3, or study Tanya, or all 3. So sadness is a serious problem, but bitterness in moderation is actually the key to growth. And that's the moral. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Rabbi. Is the bitter herbs then the Yetzer Hara?
Not necessarily. The bitter herbs could be the bitterness of the godly soul. When the godly soul is not happy because of it's trapped in materialism. right? So bitterness is just, I'm not satisfied with where I am. That is a good quality if it's bitter and not sad, and if it motivates to growth. So it also in moderation, the Talmud says bitterness, there's an advantage to bitterness leads to an advantage, which means bitterness, the state of bitterness itself is not good. We're not seeking bitterness, but this bitterness occasionally in moderation could lead to something good. So no, it doesn't have to be the godly soul also has bitterness. In other words, it's the longing. If you think about longing, think about love. There's different forms of love, but a love that different forms of love. There's love like fire, love like water, which is basically a love of longing or a love of pleasure. And a love of longing is difficult and painful. King Solomon says in the Song of Songs, which hopefully we'll study on Fridays after Passover, he says, Ki aza kamavet ahava. Love is as powerful as death. In other words, there's a certain pain within love, a love of longing that is like bitterness. But on the other hand, that's what motivates people to get together and cross oceans and overcome obstacles because of that longing. So the
Rabbi?
longing has a sense of bitterness. Yes.
Okay. My experience is that some people who are bitter are passive. They just go over and over and over again their bitterness, and it doesn't get them to make that move. So bitterness could be a motivation, but sometimes bitterness is not a motivation.
Correct.
So I think we have to look at bitterness of a little bit more. You have to analyze it, and you have to reflect on the bitterness before you act or don't act on it.
Correct. And the bitterness in English doesn't capture this, because in English, bitterness just sounds like, just a bitter person, sounds like a person who's pessimistic, sounds like a person whatever sees bad in every scenario. So the English fails to capture this, but you are 100% correct. The sense of being unhappiness, I'm not happy with my state, even it could have energy. So there's a way where it's sadness where it drains me of energy. It also could be in a way that there is energy there, but my energy is expressed in a bad way where I scream at the people around me, for example. And that's why channeling the bitterness, channeling the bitter herbs is a very important skill. And if you want more information how to do that, Rabbi Schneur Zalman, in the founding book of Chabad philosophy, out of 53 chapters, 9 of them is dealing with the sadness and bitterness. So you see, this is a big deal in the Chassid spiritual life, because to manage the inevitable feelings of sadness and longing and disappointment and pain, that's part of life. You can't ignore it. And to manage that and make sure that it expresses itself in a productive way, not a destructive way, is a very important concept. And Jill's right. Don't embrace any form of bitterness. You have to make sure it's channeled and examined and used properly. I agree. Okay, one last point about the sandwich, because that's the last major ingredient. And then either we'll get into specifics or we'll just do a quick review. The sandwich, what do we do in our Passover? Our Passover set is very inefficient. If your goal is to get to the meal, which is some people's goal, we don't do it the most efficient way. First of all, we speak too much. That's an old Jewish problem. The Maggid is too long. But the other problem is that here's what we do. We eat the matzah, we eat the bitter herbs, and then we eat the sandwich with the matzah and the bitter herbs together. And by the time I finish the matzah and the bitter herbs, the sandwich, I have no room. I can't eat anything. I'm full. I'm ready for dessert. The problem is the dessert is the matzah. So I'm back to square one. So the issue here is, why don't we go straight to the sandwich? What's the point of eating matzah, bitter herbs, and then the sandwich? That's the question. Now, the answer, there is a technical answer or a legal answer. And I don't want to get too detailed because it will take too much time. But basically, long story short, today, when we don't have the Paschal offering, the matzah is a biblical commandment. The bitter herbs is a rabbinic commandment. And therefore, they cannot be combined. Because when there's a biblical commandment, you have to consume it on it by itself. You cannot consume it with anything else that will distract of the taste. So today, in today's day and age, we have to have we have to have the matzah, which is a biblical commandment, and the bitter herbs as a rabbinic commandment. We have to eat them separate. However, to commemorate the time of the temple, where they had matzah, bitter herbs, and Pesach offering, which means a piece of roast, all three were biblical, and they were able to eat it in a sandwich. So to commemorate the sandwich, we also eat a sandwich. Okay, so we have a problem. We cannot, on one hand, we can't combine the matzah and the bitter herbs because one is biblical, one's rabbinic. On the other hand, you want to commemorate the time when they were all biblical and we could all eat them together. Why were they all biblical? Because, okay, there's a verse that says you should eat the Pesach meat, the Pesach offering, the Pesach's roast with matzah and bitter herbs. That means if there's no Pesach roast, there's no matzah and there's no bitter herbs. So the bitter herbs are not our rabbinic today because we have no Pesach offering. There's no biblical obligation to eat bitter herbs. They are rabbinic. So why is the matzah biblical? Because in addition to that verse, there's a separate verse that says, a standalone verse that says, in the evening, eat matzah. Oh, so matzah is biblical by itself. So again, I don't want to get into this whole thing. It's a full page in the Talmud. The bottom line is we eat the matzah, which is biblical. We eat the maror, which is the bitter herbs, which is rabbinic, because we can't combine the two. And then we eat the sandwich together to commemorate the fact that in biblical times, we had them all as a sandwich. Of course, today we're missing the main ingredient. It's like you go to a steakhouse and they say, okay, here is the pita, here is the mustard, but we forgot to give you the meat. Okay, you say you're missing the main ingredient. You didn't come here for bread, you came here for the meat. So right now we're missing the main ingredient, which was the Pesach offering, but that's another story. Okay, what does this mean? What's the equivalent in the spiritual life of the Jew? So, Yelena, do you want to ask something?
Yeah. Is there any fasting involved? Like, for example, on Saturday before the meal?
Fasting? No. The only thing we do is we're not supposed to eat matzah the day of Passover. So the day before Passover. So if the Seder night is the Seder night, we have to eat matzah as we want to have. Let's say you have to eat matzah with an appetite. So we don't eat matzah the day before the Seder. Mm-hmm. So that eliminates some of what if you people who eat a lot of bread or matzah, it eliminates if you eat a grain diet, it eliminates a lot because you can't eat bread because you can't eat bread anymore after a certain time, and you can't eat matzah till the night. Okay. But in any case, okay, so what's the equivalent in the spiritual life? There's so many different interpretations. I'll give you one. I'm sure there are many others. Matzah represents the freedom. Why do we eat the matzah? Because when we left Egypt, the bread did not have time to rise. Matzah represents the positive times. God comes and helps us. There are miracles in our life. Everything is going the way it should be. Everything is wonderful. That's matzah. What do the bitter herbs represent? Bitter herbs, like I said before, now I'm saying something different. That's okay. Bitter herbs represent challenges. There's difficulties in my life. Every person, to some degree in their life, has matzah moments and maror moments. Moments that are positive, moments that are negative, moments of you feel the divine kindness, and sometimes you feel abandoned by God. You have both. You have the bitter herbs and you have the matzah. Now, you have the bitter herbs and matzah. Now, what happens is that usually we experience these two things as separate entities. We have a good moment and a bad moment. They're separate. And that's why in the beginning, we eat the matzah and we eat the bitter herbs separately. We commemorate two different parts of our life. But then, and today we have to do it because there's no sandwich today. There's no obligation to eat the sandwich. Sandwich would mean, could you combine the two? Oh, that's a big idea. Now, then we commemorate what happened in times of the temple. Times of the temple, while a person is experiencing something negative, in other words, in the times of the temple, while the person is experiencing the bitter herbs, the person sees the bitter herbs as part of a sandwich, which means there's a greater story here, which means the bitter herbs and the matzah, the positive moment and the negative moment, is all part of one whole. Why? Because I could see within the negativity how that makes me a better person, how that's an opportunity to dig deeper and be forced to find deeper energy within myself and discover power within myself that I never knew I had. So today, when I experience something negative, while I'm experiencing it, I don't see it as something positive. If I overcome it and I look back, I say, you know, that negative experience, actually, there was some positivity to that. In the times of the temple, the Jewish people were on a higher spiritual level. They could eat it together. Within the bitterness, within the bitterness, in the same sandwich, you see the liberation. You see the positive effect that the negative experience has upon you. But today it's much harder for us to do. So today we first experience it as two separate parts of our life. Then we grow to the point where we say, you know what? It could be that they're actually part of one sandwich. It could be that both the negative parts of our life and the positive parts of our life together combine to get us where we need to be, to make us the person we need to be, and to bring out the greatest potential. And that would be the idea of the sandwich, of the combination that follows the having them separate. So what we want to do right now, it's 10:59. I want to just address Elena's question for one more second, and then do a quick review, and then questions. So Elena's question is there a fast? There is a, Barry pointed out to me, there is a separate issue, which is that only for the firstborn. If you're a firstborn son, which I am not, the day before Passover every year, there's a fast day, but you can convert the fast day if you participate in a joyous meal, a meal of a mitzvah, and therefore it becomes the custom that people go to hear a siyum, to hear the conclusion of a tractate of the Talmud, because that's a fast, that's a meal of a mitzvah. And if you eat the meal of the mitzvah, you don't have to fast that day. If this year we don't do it on Shabbat, so we do it on Thursday. Today, this morning at Chabad Greenwich, there was a meal for the firstborn, a siyum, a conclusion, a party for the conclusion of a tractate for the firstborn. But that is just for a minority of the population. For everybody else, there's no fast on the day of Passover, just a fast of matzah. We don't eat matzah. Okay, so just to review what we said, because we said many points. Of course, there's a lot more to say. God willing, next year, in good health, in person or online. Either way, it's okay. If you don't want to come in person next year, it's fine. You can do it online. Well, hopefully we'll still be doing Zoom next year in good health. But more information to come back next year. Just to summarize quickly the points we discussed. First of all, we said Egypt. What's Egypt? Egypt is my limitation. And there has to be an exodus every year, maybe even every day, but certainly every year. What's the exodus mean? Going beyond my limitation, expanding, going out of the stagnation. What's the Pharaoh that keeps me trapped? Pharaoh is my ego. I'm afraid to fail. I'm afraid of rejection. I'm afraid of what people would say. I'm afraid of disappointment. All that focus on self is the Pharaoh that keeps me trapped. What's the antidote to the Pharaoh? Matzah, humility. Our humility is not focusing on self, focusing on what needs to be done. And then we discussed that's why the matzah has speed, because one point is that there's two parts of humility. One type of humility is I say I'm nothing. If I'm nothing, I'm just going to stay in bed. If I'm nothing, I'm not motivated to change. That's not the humility we're talking about. We're talking about the humility that is associated with speed. Speed would mean I'm not focusing on self. I'm doing what needs to be done. And that's the notion of speed, which leads us to the next point of speed, which we mentioned, is that rarely does our inner Pharaoh tell us outright to do something destructive and abandon all hope for good and growth. No. What it does, it tells us delay. You want to grow, you want to start doing something positive, you want to start a good habit, you want to get rid of your negative habits, no problem, next Tuesday, right? So it's delaying. And that delay is what makes the chametz, what makes the leavened bread, what keeps me trapped. Freedom is speed. Like to say you have a mitzvah, you have an opportunity to do something good, don't waste it, don't delay it, engage immediately, and that's the key to freedom. Then we discussed the idea of 4 cups of wine, which means initially the act of breaking free is difficult. It doesn't have a taste. It doesn't taste good. It doesn't feel good. When you're starting a new habit, it's not enjoyable. However, you're going to get to the point where you have 4 cups of wine where that same growth now becomes pleasurable and enjoyable as 4 cups of wine. For those who enjoy wine, I don't count myself amongst them. But for those who enjoy wine, it's certainly a symbol of pleasure, a symbol of taste, unlike the matzah, which is, at least on the night of Passover, supposed to be, by design, tasteless. And then, of course, we discussed the bitter herbs. And the bitter herbs is you needed a spice, a dash of unhappiness to be able to grow, because that's what creates the ambition, and that's what creates the longing to say, I'm not making peace with my current situation, whatever, on any front, in any field. It could be professional, it could be personal, it could be personal growth. I don't like the person. If I'm totally and completely enamored with the person I am, I'm not going to grow. I have to say, well, some things about me, I wish I would be a little bit more, I'm a better listener, whatever it may be. I need to, and the unhappiness is the bitterness that allows me to break free of Egypt. And of course, the sandwich, if we can get to the spiritual state, that the challenge is part of the matzah. The challenge, the bitter herbs, is the same sandwich as the liberation. I could sense in the challenge how the challenge is actually making me a better person and liberating me. It's very hard to do right now. That's why it's not a commandment. Usually we do it separate. We say we have a positive moment, we have a negative moment. Then we get to the point where they're actually one and the same. We can recognize that they're one and the same. They both have the same goal. They're both leading us to the same place. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining. Thank you for allowing me to repeat these points, because you got to relive them every year. And now all we have to do is celebrate them on Saturday night. And of course, that will help us internalize it. And we will all be changed people, completely changed, new people. So next time I see you, it's going to be a new person.
Amen.
Have a wonderful, wonderful Pesach and a wonderful day. And we're going to
Thank
take a
you,
break.
Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Take a
you.
break for next week. Next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Always
you.
an inspiration.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Rabbi,
You
have
were-
you,
Rabbi.
have you looked through the new Chabad Haggadah?
Okay, I have to stop the recording first.